Hello and greetings. Welcome back to our Health Disparities Summit. Again, as I understand it, Summit 2. Again, thank you all for being here and being a part of this experience. It is my hope that you have had some information sharing at this particular summit that has been beneficial and useful for you to take back to your respective organizations, into your respective communities, to continue to be a force for change and to continue to make our communities healthy and safe. So this portion of our presentation, which is probably one of my favorite portions of it, because it focuses on youth to a greater degree, because in many ways, much to do of all of what I've talked about today have hit upon pieces and parts unto youth, have hit upon pieces and parts unto vaccination, and also hit upon pieces and parts to particular challenges that we have getting this vaccination and getting needs to particular groups of people in our communities, more specifically our African Americans, our Native Americans, our Latinos, perhaps our Asian Americans. And again, our communities have such a diverse group of people in them, and they vary from community to community, region to region. So what the makeup here is in and throughout the Mississippi Delta region of the United States will definitely be different from the makeup variation unto the Appalachian region of the United States and other states and regions throughout the country. So that's where we are. To head us off into this part of our speaking engagement, I came across another quote that is a very important quote, and I felt like it was a good quote to catapult us into this last presentation, Youth Vaccinations and What Have We Heard About Immunity. So the quote is nothing about us without us. So as we think about our families, and as we think about children, we have to think about that particular quote. And at the end of the day, what that particular quote gets at is the importance of including us being whatever the group, the distinctive groups are in your communities. They must be included. And if they are not included, it decreases the likelihood that they will participate in any initiative set forth and throughout the communities. In this case, it probably explains that if in these communities they haven't been concluded, it may have a lot to do with why their presence is not being seen when it comes to getting the vaccines. It may speak to why there is a hesitancy, why there is a reluctance in getting that vaccine. And so in this part of the vaccine, of the presentation, I felt like this was be a good place to kind of focus on some developmental things, some traits and characteristics particularly specific unto the middle childhood and the youth years. middle childhood and adolescent years, depending on how you want to look at it. So that brings us to the place by which I want to introduce the term that I'm sure many of you all are familiar with, but I want to introduce egocentrism. Because one of the things that we see is that in this period unto adolescence, and even we can see these signs in the middle the middle childhood years as they're moving from becoming egocentric in infancy to sociocentric in the middle years to becoming egocentric once again in the period of adolescence. And we'll also discover that even those that we consider adults, but in the early stages of adulthood, are still very much egocentric. So to a great degree, many people and children around this age and stage have a slight issue of seeing the world from a limited lens. They see the world from their standpoint only. What's important unto them, what's valuable unto them, they have yet to demonstrate the capability of taking the perspective of others into context, because they only see the world from an egocentric standpoint. It's only about me, I, the self, from an individualistic standpoint. David Elkind was, David Elkind, I think, is a great person to talk about insofar as giving us a good theoretical understanding about what's going on in the period of adolescence and helping us to understand the years of the youth. And he's not the only theorist that I think is key and critical to understanding this period, but I think that there are some pieces and parts to his ideals that are worthy of being mentioned today. And as we talk about this notion of adolescent egocentrism, it seeks expression in multiple ways. One of the ways by which it seeks expression is through the creation of what Elkind called the imaginary audience. And this is the belief system that others are so focused on themselves that consequently they're not aware of what's going on everywhere else. And so what he's saying is that during this particular point in time, adolescents experience an ideology rooted in the imaginary audience. And so it makes it very, very difficult for them to engage in perspective taking. It makes it very difficult for them to think about others because they're so self-absorbed into themselves. Consequently, it's very useful and beneficial to take this under consideration toward understanding other challenges and or problems that adolescents oftentimes face. Another key point that he being David Elkind brought up was this notion of the personal fable. This is the belief system that something about me or the self is so unique, so special, that no one else has really had that experience or can offer a position to help me deal with my experience. My life experiences are so unique that feedback from others cannot be useful, cannot be beneficial. Imagine that. That gives us some insight into thinking about some of the challenges that we have as adults and as parents when interacting and working with our children. Some of this behavior that we sometimes think is oppositional is really just developmental. Not all of it, but Some of it is just developmental. And part of this egocentrism that seeks expression during this time period manifests itself in yet a third way that is coined the invincibility fable. The belief that something about me is so special, so unique, that I'm impervious to consequences. There are people who engage in risk-taking behaviors. I don't know, I'll just throw a few things out there as example, like unprotected sex. And they get pregnant. But there's something so special about me that wouldn't happen to me. There are people who get sick, but it won't happen to me. So there's something about this stage and this challenge that's developmental that in many cases increase the likelihood that youth and our young Americans are more comfortable engaging in risk-taking behaviors because it won't happen to me. I know that it happens to other people, but for some reason, there's something so special about me that I'm buffered, I am protected, I'm shielded from these experiences, and therefore it will not happen to me. Young children are vulnerable. Young children are impressionable. And as we think about this as a general concept, just imagine to me the ideals that exist in the minds of young children who are also dealing and coming from communities that are Black and brown, impoverished communities, and or just communities where the families and or the children are marginalized. These things increase the likelihood that who they listen to is important. What they listen to is valuable. And consequently, the extent to which they listen to you is critical because it's, in the minds of many of them, it's a matter of safety. It's a matter of life and death, not just to our youth, but also to the families who support our youth. That's why relationships have to be built and developed. These relationships have to be built and developed in a more permanent way than the way that we have done so in some communities. That's why we have to go back into the communities and we have to reestablish and find out and discover who the stakeholders are in these communities and what are they saying in these communities, and find out why they are not supportive. What do they believe about the vaccine? What are their ideals? What I find is that when I listen to people in rural America, and as they talk about the vaccine, their ethnicity and their race and their geographic location is a powerful indicator of their acceptance. What I also find is that the places where they live, work, and play, in many cases, is providing them with different information. Or, I'll put it differently, inconsistent information. And in many cases, because the information is inconsistent, they're not going to act. You know, and it's a little hard to go back and forth between children and families, because for me, the feedback is the same. But at the end of the day, there's only 3 responses to stress. There's fight, there's flight, and then there's freeze. When vaccines were introduced in our societies, and even in rural America, a certain percentage rushed in to get the vaccine. Let's call them flighters. And there was a certain percentage of anti-vacciners who perpetuated messages. Let's call them fighters. A lot of the people that we see today, and the challenges and the difficulties that we're faced with, are people who are freezing because they haven't heard consistent messages. So as I navigate in and throughout rural America, and I have that discussion with people to figure out what their thinking is, their thinking causes them to freeze. They're saying things like, I don't know, I've heard that this vaccine does X or Y or Z. The messages are so inconsistent that for many of them, they would just rather do nothing. For many of them, they just want to sit back and see what happens to other people. And again, and as I stated earlier today, for many, they're not going to move unless key people in their families, key people in their life circles where they live, work, and play, signal to them to move. I keep mentioning across my speaking engagement the elephant in the room. We have to deal with the elephant in the room. We, as a nation, have made this topic a political topic. So for that reason, it's a very toxic topic. And it has implications unto people who vary across cultures. The settings by which we get information are flooded with misinformation. And people get information in different ways from different groups and statuses within their community. And the information is inconsistent. It's unclear. It's ambiguous. It's inconsistent across parents and teachers and community representatives. And so given all of this, there's some level of sense to the fact that certain groups of people would choose to let time pass before they act on this, and even though this is arguably for their own good. And again, because many people represent members or constituent groups uh, where they have a history of being marginalized. And because they don't always see themselves at the table, they don't always trust, feel, and believe that this vaccine is for their own good. Now, I hate to speak on this issue so basically, but it's not the complex things that need to be addressed and resolved. It is the simple things. Those are the things that oftentimes we error and we mess up. And that's why earlier I said, and I say continuously, we have to go back to the basics and rebuild our communities the same way we have historically done it, but now we have to do so by being more inclusive. Boots on the ground, becoming comfortable, being and existing with people where they are. And yes, they are existing in some very devastating environments. It makes sense. Our great nation is great, but it still has a history of discrimination. It has a history of structural inequalities related to the socially and the economic experiences that have influenced how our families have existed and struggled to survive. At some point, we can't kick that down the road. At some point, we have to begin the process of taking steps toward addressing. The demographics of our society is changing. And listen, again, this is not just a rural phenomenon. It is indicative of the nation. And it's really not just a nation. It is indicative of the world. But rural America provides a great barometer. We can see it better because the numbers are smaller and allow for us to see the revelation. This is a time period, an era where we have opportunities to not make certain mistakes and to do things different. And this time period and this opportunity is a demonstration of perhaps whether or not we have learned from old mistakes. Perhaps it's a demonstration of whether or not we're willing to do things differently and reconstruct our communities in a way that propels us and prepares us to be to make that transition into the future. I guess one way of thinking about this is to think about it within other terms and in other contexts, because then we can see things in a way that influences this context. Historically, with our social inequalities and our economic inequalities and our race inequalities, a lot of times these things have influenced our laws such that they have entrapped certain members of certain groups. The best example that I can think of just off the top of my head right now is that, and this is a well-documented fact, that there are certain drugs that are recreational drugs unto certain members of Black and brown communities And those drugs carry a higher sentence than drugs that may be used by white Americans. It wasn't that the drugs were more or less potent. The sentences were predicated on a desire to create harder rules for certain members of certain communities, to increase the incarceration of certain members so that the economics could be maintained by doing that. And a lot of those decisions have historically been done. There's a very popular book, if you're interested, called Race to Incarcerate by Mark, M-A-R-C. I forget his first name. And I can't put my eyes on the book right now. But I said all of that to say that there are certain influences that we have to be aware of. And these things superimpose itself upon the overall viability of a community. Here's what I mean by that. So, if we leave these policies in place, then what of our future communities? And what of the quality of our rural communities as our rural communities are becoming more diverse? So it is befitting to say, and I've talked a lot about infrastructure, but also the way we do things create structural anomalies in such a way that it make it difficult and or easy for certain members of certain groups to have a better quality or a worse quality of life, to navigate the communities and to navigate society in a better way or a more difficult way. But as our communities are becoming more diverse, can we really afford to have the same pitfalls in 2022 and beyond as we've had in the 80s or the 90s or early 2000s? Structurally speaking, are there changes that need to occur because our society is evolving? Our society is different. These are questions that we have to ask ourselves. Incidentally, in rural America, there's a resistance to change. Rural America, because of migration trends in and out over the decades, rural America has two very, very large groups and distinctively different. In rural America, there's a disparity, is a high amount of senior members of society. And in rural America is a high amount of Black and brown members of society. But there are also some other subcategorizations that are occurring in rural America as well. And I'm speaking in general now because I can't speak to the specifics of key and critical areas. And to be honest, what's going on in rural America is just a barometer unto the nation. But when we look into white America, we're producing smaller families, fewer kids. When we look into brown America in the nation, we're producing larger families, more children. And so slowly but surely, the demographics are changing, not only in the nation, but also in rural America. And the trends are well documented, and the projections that I've seen up into 2060 now. So we have to be aware, and we have to be comfortable. Fight, flight, freeze is what we do and how we handle stress. How are we going to handle and how are we addressing in rural America? And it's not for me to decide that, but for each and every one of our communities. We have to begin the process of preparing people to come to the table, preparing people to sit and exist with people who are different from them, and to be comfortable with that, to be okay with that, to begin the process of hashing out and addressing issues. Increasingly, more Black and brown children are born today and existing in our communities. Increasingly, our Latino Americans are growing and increasing. In fact, African Americans are not even the largest minority group in the United States today. It's Latino Americans. More Native Americans and Asian Americans existing today. You know what the fastest growing minority group today, and projected if growth continues this way, the largest minority group by 2060 could be Asian Americans. Now, people may not necessarily identify in these terms that we created: African Americans, Latino X, Native American, Asian Americans. Because in this society, people get to choose. In this society, there's a lot of biracial families. And so where do they choose? What category do they choose? A great degree of the categorizations that we have today, increasingly, it's being demonstrated, are old categories until a time period when we segregated people and we categorized people a certain way. I mean, race is more of a social construction than it is a biological construction. But not just race is the issue and the challenge of our communities today, and more particularly, or just as particularly, rural America. But also our children growing up today, there are increasing numbers or disclosures of members that represent the LGBTQ community: lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, transgender. And this presents us with some challenges. And when I say this presents us with challenges, those of us who understand the importance of bringing people together in the same room, there seems to be a resistance to certain types of categories by which we define people. Increasingly, in and amongst the LGBTQ community, there's a greater likelihood of rejecting the categories that we've had before. And that's why the categories that are increasingly prevalent are some that have, they appear to be getting larger and larger because, you know, some people say, I don't really fall in the category of gay or lesbian, because perhaps I'm some variation of both. And so the old definitions become too restrictive. Perhaps someone falls in the category where they are born male, but they identify as female, or the reverse, transgender. Perhaps I fall in other categories because of my preference, which may have nothing to do with my biological distinction. Increasingly, these things are hard things for many of us to grapple with. And especially if we are not accustomed to change. As our communities are changing, as people are evolving, the question is, to what degree and to what level of comfort are we going to have, and are we going to support respective to our community? Because remember, in the best of outcomes, to create the best of change, the best of innovation towards solving many of the challenges that we face today in rural America, we have to be inclusive, not exclusive. Our communities are becoming more diverse, and we need all of the talent that we can to bring them and make them a part of the experience, make them a part of the equation. Incidentally, in some communities, the life experiences of children who fall in certain categories are not very different. Because some children are just coming from families where they're just poor, and they too are marginalized. Some children engage in risky behaviors, perhaps behaviors to and in and of a way that increases their susceptibility to consequences. And they too, and depending on the community and depending on the experiences, they too can be marginalized. Why is that important? Because people have to feel like there's a place for them at the table. If we're going to expect people to change, they have to be brought to the table in some way, in some form, in some fashion. Otherwise, we'll continue to have some of the issues that we're faced with today. They will continue to occur. They will continue to challenge us. And tomorrow's pandemic might be a little bit more difficult to address or resolve. Tomorrow's strand may be a little more difficult to find a cure. That is an impending reality in the life outcomes of many of our fellow citizens. Black and brown families are at high risks. Communities are replete with questions that need to be answered as a precursor to participation. You know, when we fall outside of certain communities, we may feel like the questions make no sense or make little sense or have little rationale. We have to understand that this is the barrier. We must find ways to answer their questions. A lot of people's questions are coming from their trauma. A lot of people have historical trauma, social trauma, and this trauma gives them fears. This trauma hinders or impedes their ability to trust, value, and or act on anything that you say. So again, at a very basic level, we got to go back to build relationship. Relationship, relationship, relationship. And it takes expression in many ways. Because with relationship, we can restore trust. With relationship, we can restore the sub-elements that are essential and necessary toward creating community. The greater the vulnerability, the fewer the COVID-19 sites, and the lower the capacity of adequate hospitals. Which is to say that there are some areas in some rural communities that are hospital deserts, that are healthcare deserts. There's no hospital or healthcare facility within 30 to 50 miles of some people. The living conditions are abhorrible. But we still have to get them vaccinated. We still have to get the message. We still have to get boots on the ground. In the intersections with minority health and the rural health population is an issue of equity. Too frequently in the past, people's experience with healthcare access and health facilities have been violated. Time has passed, but the memories of that has not left them. So we have to go back in these communities and we have to build relationship, restore trust. And until we do that, there will continue to be a certain level of hesitancy. So, who or what influences these subgroups of people? Whether they're youth or whether they are adults, and especially if they are a part of a marginalized community, someone is influencing them. Who and or what is influencing them? Ergo, once we find out who, then that influences who we need to target to influence. So the influence of community leaders and older family members is key and critical in some marginalized groups of Americans. And by identifying who they are, you find a slow but sure way of changing their mindset. And it's going to start out slow. But here's the thing. When you start to get the right people and you change their mindset, they're going to do the rest of the work. Also, fear of side effects and misinformation need to be dealt with. Many people in rural America and in marginalized America have legitimate questions about the side effects of this vaccine. And it's at the crux of their fear. We have to find other ways of addressing their concerns. Sometimes we say things like, well, the data says this. But these are not always people who have good experiences with intellectual people or medical or oriented people, the medical profession, the medical community. So we really have to find a way to figure out who's the voices that need to be talked to, answer their concerns, calm their feelings. And by this, in part, is how we silence the critics, by using the voices recognized by the community, the leaders. You can't know who these people are except that you go into the community and that you have a presence in these communities. You can't be successful at doing these things if you're just here for a period of time and then you're gone. These are ongoing things. There's an ongoing presence that's needed in and with rural America. Rural America has experienced a whole host of issues. And again, these things are not unique to rural America, but we're here today talking about the challenges of rural America. People are frustrated. There are too many things that have happened and are happening that affects their ability to predict and control their reality. People don't know who their neighbor is anymore. Some of it is because of things like immigration and acculturation stressors. People are migrating in and migrating out. And so therefore, if you will, the cohesiveness of the community is not there because the changes in faces and it's so different. Some of it is rooted in the experiences of discrimination. And they're coming from marginalized communities where there's a history of them being targeted. And targeted by people who they should have trusted or they should have been able to trust. And so consequently, many of these people have historical and generational trauma, historical and generational fear. So some of this I run to, some of this I run away, and some I freeze. Many of these communities have been hit by natural disasters and man-made disasters. I talked earlier about the research that I did in my early years and worked on groundwater contamination and companies buying land and contaminating land. The contaminants made their way to the groundwater. People all of a sudden started dying of cancers. Black Americans. Because the land was intentionally purchased for a region, for an area that was not valued And so these challenges and these issues are issues that have continued to exist. Now, we're definitely in a better place than we have been historically, because the world has continued to evolve. But people don't forget the challenges just because the challenges change. And so many people are still struggling with many of these issues, let alone the family and community violence. So for all of these reasons and so many more, we have in rural America families and youth particularly that are struggling with issues of depression and anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and again, and as I indicated earlier today, high levels of suicidal ideation. But they're not just thinking about suicide, they're acting on suicide. People who've had this level of stress placed on them and for so long of a period of time that they are now distorting reality in a way that makes them feel good and feel better in the surreality, because the reality is too painful. And now we have this pandemic and people are saying we need to get this vaccine for the good of everybody. It saves everybody. Many of these people, or I should say, some representatives in some groups, some pockets of rural America, are saying simple things like, why now? Why is this issue so important? Why are you coming into the community now when I've been struggling for such a long time? Again, the elephant in the room must be addressed. We must find a way to help people think, feel differently about the services that we want to provide. That is the only way to break the cycle. I talked a little bit about this earlier, but we need to find ways to reconstruct our communities in such a way that equity is spread across the community, irrespective of people's diverse backgrounds, irrespective of people's socioeconomic backgrounds or experiences, irrespective of people's age. Again, rural America is very vulnerable. It has disproportionately higher percentages of senior members. It has higher percentages, increasing numbers of minority youth as well. People coming from a socioeconomic perspective that's different, people coming from ethnic, cultural differences, and together they're supposed to find ways to work together to address issues when they do not have a history of experiences of working together. This and these are the challenges that we're faced with today. So other points to consider. Even the most autonomous of voices yields to a collective voice of reasoning. One of the reasons why some groups are successful, like people who are anti-vacciners, one of the reasons why they are so successful is that they say that they get the same message out, and it's across a collective chorus of people within their groups, their constituent groups, their teams. The same message that is communicated in these circles, you can find that same message on the internet. Even the most autonomous voices yield to the collective voice of reasoning. And so therefore, we have to find the right words and the right persons to change and offset the campaign against the vaccine. Also, it is not always what is said, but the frequency by which it's heard. We need to find a uniform language and way of expressing what need to be expressed to these families. A consistent message about this vaccine, a consistent message about the benefits and or the challenges or the obstacles. We need to start to become comfortable with what we don't know and find ways to get this to the community. Marginalized youth come from a host of issues and experiences and experience multiple issues within the consequences, where the consequences are overlapping. You know what? At the end of the day, they become numb to the threats. They start to feel helpless. And so many of them don't see this threat any different from other threats that they have experienced. Let's see, what else do I have here? The condition of many of these children and communities represent multi-occurring vulnerabilities. And again, that's really just an offshoot of what I just said. They have multiple issues. They have multiple challenges, multiple obstacles. We have to find ways to get them support and to support multiple issues. Perhaps if we played roles in addressing other issues, then this increases the likelihood that they'll listen to some of the recommendations and the concerns that we have respective to this issue. And I think the last point that I put on here is that the problems of rural America are similar to the problems of urban and suburban America. However, resources are not distributed the same. It's not a lot of money trickles this in the same way. It's not evenly dispersed in rural America. And there are some that even argue that the resources unto the nation are not equally and evenly dispersed between the urban centers of America and the rural centers, and the suburban centers of America. So there is a disbursement issue that must be dealt with and must be improved. Now, these issues are greater than perhaps those of us within the context of this presentation, but there are specific individual and small roles that each and every one of us can and will play that improves on that overall outcome. It's not the big things that we do, but the small things that we do that makes our communities better, that improves our communities. We do them in small morsels, small bites, small steps. Because when we do things too fast, that becomes stressful. And when things are stressful like that, people are more likely to freeze. Therefore, find out who your influencers are. Find out who's changing and altering the community. Find out what key people are saying in many of these minority groups, in many of these marginalized families. Find out who is the go-to person that people listen to. Because if we change them, they will do the rest of the work. In some communities, once you get Big Mama on page, she's going to bring the whole family and get them vaccinated. We also have to be comfortable having these crucial conversations. We cannot afford not to have them. We cannot afford to kick them down the road. They must be addressed. And they're crucial conversations. They're difficult to have because we haven't had them before. We also have to, as we think about bringing people to the table who haven't been brought to the table before, with people who have been at the table historically, we have to be patient and attentive. We have to understand that it's going to take time for people who have not worked together to find ways to work together. And the real factors to change are rarely stated early. They're rarely dealt with and addressed initially. It takes time. Also, one of the ways we deal with fear is by doing nothing at all. As I stated earlier, there's fight, there's flight, and then there is freeze. Some people are choosing to do nothing at all. They're waiting on something. They're waiting for a consistent message. They're waiting for a clarity. Perhaps we need to start advertising differently and improve the ways we advertise information. Make everyone part of the plan. And last but not least, reignite mentoring programs in rural America. Those things were effective, but we kind of, as the community has slowly eroded, and as programs and funding for our schools, funding for our healthcare facilities, as these things have slowly but surely been phased out, that leaves people in rural America who don't have the infrastructure that they need to even figure out and to be purposeful beings. And we need to realize that there are young people in these communities. And if we don't have programs that guide, programs that support, programs that encourage, programs that are inclusive, then we'll continue to have people and members of society who are no good for society in reference to the direction that society is going. Okay, I think I see a sign on here that says 2 minutes. So I think that probably means that this is where I should probably stop and ask if there are any questions, comments, thoughts, or projections. Oh, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Okay. It's 2. Okay, very good. Thank you. All right. Well, Jamie, it looks like I don't have any questions at this particular point. I'll wait a few more minutes to see if there are any questions. And if there are no questions, I want to thank you all for attending this healthcare summit. This is a great thing that is being done. I'm honored to have had the opportunity to share perspectives and really to just kind of have a conversation. And there's a real hope that there's something that I've said that has sparked you to think about your service area, your rural communities, and perhaps maybe there's something that we'll do differently. Perhaps in doing differently, perhaps it's about the work that we do to help people see each other differently and to become more inclusive, because at the crux of the whole matter, and at the end of the day, is that people have to come together if they're going to address issues. They got to be together and in the same room to address these issues. They got to feel like they belong to the group to make a contribution to the group. They got to trust each other. If you don't have trust, you don't have the very main ingredient in order to build the relationships between members of society. So please, by all means, take some of these points and ideals under consideration. And just know that if you glean away, if you walk away from this presentation with 2 or 3 good points or triggered ways of thinking, reasoning about your dilemma, your challenges unto rural America, because your variation of rural America is going to be different from the experiences that I have had throughout my time in and with rural America. But as you think about these things, my hope is that you walk away with 2 or 3 good points that you turn into action points. So if there are no other questions, take this time, jot down 2 or 3 points that you can convert into action points. And action points by way of, based on this information, I am going to, and write. Very good. And if there are no other thoughts, projections, I thank you once again. And in closing, I thank you all for your attendance, and continue forth in the work that you're doing.